Good morning and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. Migration has long been a central issue in international politics, shaping economies, influencing elections, and redefining borders. But beyond the headlines and policy debates, migration is also a form of power which can be used strategically by states, negotiated through international agreements, and even exercised by migrants themselves. In an era of rising geopolitical tensions, climate induced displacement, and complex migration deals, understanding the power dynamics of migration has never been more urgent. Joining me today to explore this critical topic is Professor Gerasimos Tsourapas, the 125th Anniversary Chair and Professor of International Relations at the University of Birmingham. Professor Tsourapas recently published an insightful article titled Understanding Migration Power in International Studies in International Affairs. The link to the piece is attached in the description box below, so do check it out. Thank you so much, sir, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for this.
So, I would like to begin the conversation by asking that what initially drew you to explore the intersection of migration and power in international relations, and can you share some key insights drawn from your recent article in International Affairs?
Sure. Thank you again for the invitation. I've always been interested in how people on the move reshape international politics. Early on in my research, especially while working on Egypt and the Arab world, I noticed that migration was more than just about people moving to escape hardship or to find another job abroad. Migration was also a tool. So my first book a few years ago with Cambridge University Press highlighted exactly this. How do authoritarian regimes use labor migration as an instrument to survive, to build alliances, or to extract resources? And this was evidently clear in Egypt. Egypt's strategies under Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 50s and 60s, to Sadat, to Mubarak, and it's clear today under Sisi as well. Neighboring Egypt, Libya, under Gaddafi, also uses migration to negotiate with Europe and its neighbors. And this is again something that continues with Haftar and the fragmented Libyan authorities today. So actually, just a few days ago, we saw this tensions over migration routes emerge between Greece, the European Union, and Libyan actors, and this turned into a proper diplomatic standoff. All of these examples demonstrate that states use cross-border mobility as a way to influence neighbors, even in very fragile contexts. And what is surprising is that despite all this, the field of international relations historically treated migration as a marginal issue that is separate from questions of power or questions of security. Even today, most textbooks in international relations do not include migration when discussing diplomacy, coercion, or state agency. Yet my work demonstrates that population mobility does shape power relations in multiple ways. So bringing this back to your introduction, this is what we now describe as migration power, an idea that I have developed with my colleague Irene Fernández-Molina at the University of Exeter. Our framework demonstrates how states, particularly states in the global south, use migration as a way to negotiate influence, to resist pressure from outside, or to manage asymmetries. So overall, what we want to show is that migration is not about mobility or movement alone, but it's also about power.
Yeah. So how can your typology of migration power, compulsory, institutional, structural, and productive, help policymakers better understand and shape international migration agreements such as the UK-Rwanda deal or the EU-Egypt Pact, and very recently we saw France and UK deal as well on this?
Yes. Well, so we developed this framework as part of this article in 2024 for International Affairs. What we wanted to do is move beyond the argument that migration deals are just transactions. Most policymakers continue to treat arrangements like the UK-Rwanda plan or the EU-Egypt partnership that was signed last year as one-off exchanges. So money for containment or resettlement for deterrence, right? But when you unpack these deals and these agreements through the prism of migration power, you see these four dimensions at work. So we talk firstly about compulsory power, which for us is the most visible. This is the threat to control people's movement, or the promise also to control people's movements. The most potent example of this remains Turkey. Turkey in 2015, 2016, in the context of the European refugee crisis, repeatedly threatens the European Union to loosen border controls in order to extract concessions. Similarly, the EU-Egypt arrangements works in a very interesting fashion, depending on Egypt's ability to contain flows, right? But it also carries within it this implicit threat that illegal or irregular border crossings could resume if Europe stops supporting the Egyptian regime.
Yeah.
Beyond this, go ahead.
No, sir, continue. Yeah.
I was gonna walk you through the other three aspects of power just to briefly discuss them. Beyond this, we're talking about institutional power, and institutional power revolves around rules or frameworks that make these deals durable. So one example of this would be something like the mobility partnerships that the European Union signs with states like Morocco that link migration control to broader cooperation agreements. They build in readmission clauses, they data share, they have regular monitoring provisions, and so on and so forth. I'm actually part of a Horizon Europe project called GAPS, where we examine exactly these patterns of return diplomacy and how they fit into institutional migration power. A third aspect is structural power, and this, again, drawing on international relations, we look at how hosting or blackmailing migration and migrants shapes dependencies. In other words, think of Egypt, right, and its position within this EU pact to illustrate structural power. Cairo functions not only as a corridor of migration, but also as a regional stabilizer. By hosting large amounts of refugees, Egypt attracts development aid, it attracts investment, it opens up diplomatic recognition possibilities. Jordan is another actual example of this. By hosting millions of Syrian refugees, Jordan has secured significant international funding, and it has really reinforced its position as a regional, reliable partner. So structural migration power allows us to see how states can use migration to anchor themselves in these hierarchies of economics and security. And finally, we have the question of productive power. Productive power is more about the narratives that states construct. States typically frame themselves as humane hosts, as responsible gatekeepers, as examples of deterrence. Rwanda, in the UK Rwanda example, presents itself as a success story that can help manage Europe's asylum burden, right? Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, does something similar. Jordan has always projected an image of generosity, of resilience, because it has this history of hosting millions of Palestinians, of Iraqis, of Syrians, and other displaced communities. And this, the Jordanian government hopes, gives it moral recognition and also material support, essentially. So what we argue in that piece is that we need to recognize that these migration deals are not transactional, but they create like these enduring systems of leverage, of dependence, and legitimacy. All too often in international relations, we adopt neo-realist approaches that tend to reduce these kinds of agreements to brickmanship, short-term accords that overlooks how migration governments tends to also accumulate historically and structurally. So that's what we aim to do. We aim to look at these agreements not just instrumentally, but also to try to acknowledge these wider political and ethical stakes that are involved, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so in recent years, we have seen that states use migration as instruments of political leverage, like with Belarus in 2021 being one example. So from a policy perspective, how can international actors respond to and deter the instrumentalization of human mobility while still upholding humanitarian principles?
Yeah, I would say there's three things that they can do. But first, a quick point to note that instrumentalization of human mobility is not new. States have used migration as leverage for decades, if not more. We can think of the Cold War, and we can think of Cuba under Fidel Castro. We can think of Gaddafi in Libya, Turkey in 2015, 2016, and more recently Belarus, which encouraged crossings of migrants into Poland and Lithuania in 2021. So we can take a look back and actually gain some understanding of how these cases demonstrate that the instrumentalization of migration arguably works best when there are divisions and inconsistencies on the receiving side. So there's a couple of things I think we can do. The first is recognition. Policymakers in Europe and elsewhere, we need to accept that migration governance is already entangled with foreign policy. If you look at the response to Belarus, you'll see that this fragmented policies that the EU put forth expose a lack of solidarity and a lack of planning, right? Contingency planning. So if states want to deter coercive uses of migrants, they must strengthen coordinated responses. They must share the burden of this fairly. They should try to avoid public splits that invite exploitation. At the second level, what states should do is to try to invest into safe and legal pathways for migrants and asylum seekers. So when states, and a lot of states can be rightly accused of this, they shut down or close formal routes, what they do is they increase the value of irregular flows, and that functions as a bargaining chip. So we really need a concerted effort towards expanding resettlement schemes, rethinking humanitarian visas, putting forth regional protection frameworks in order to reduce the appeal of manufactured crises. And third, and this is a thing where governments tend to get things wrong a bit, is that we must be careful, states rather, must be careful not to replicate instrumentalization themselves. So deals that outsource responsibilities without strong safeguards can also reproduce the very dynamics that they claim to deter. So, Ritrish, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago the agreement that was reached between the UK and France, right? The one in, one out pilot return scheme for asylum seekers that cross the channel. This kind of arrangement risks turning protection obligations again into a bargaining chip, rather than any clear kind of legal commitment. So I would say critically, any kind of return scheme must be scrutinized in order to ensure that it doesn't undermine refugee rights, it doesn't create chain refoulement, or it doesn't shift burdens in ways that puts people at risk. And
Yeah.
I think, oh, go ahead.
No, sir, continue.
I was just going to link it up to the discussion on Greece that we had earlier. And taking these 3 points into account, it allows us to be critical about what Greece is doing over the last few days. So what we're seeing is the Greek government response to Libya follow a familiar pattern of migration instrumentalization. So the Libyan authorities, fractured as they are, they know that irregular outflows of migrants creates leverage. They gain financial support, they gain diplomatic attention, bargaining space, media time, and so on and so forth. Greece, in turn, forces a real operational and political challenge on this, because it doesn't want to bury the burden, it doesn't want to carry the burden alone, but it doesn't want to appear open to coercion. But we cannot simply, and this is where the line should be drawn perhaps, suspend asylum claims for people arriving from Libya, as I think this crosses a legal and moral boundary. It breaks the principle of non-refoulement. It risks punishing individuals for the actions of the sending state, right? And we see from my research, for instance, on refugee run-terrorism, that when states instrumentalize mobility, it is always for those in motion that the worst outcomes fall onto. So I think what we need to do to stop this and to combat this phenomenon would be to name the tactic clearly, but to not mirror it by denying protection. States should strengthen lawful border management, of course. They should press for EU solidarity and genuine solidarity, and they must build frameworks that make instrumentalization costlier, essentially.
Yeah.
So in Greece, wants to maintain credibility, right, and continue being Europe's shield, quote unquote, it cannot afford to burn the legal and moral ground on which this kind of shield stands, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so your work highlights that migration power is also exercised by non-state actors and migrants themselves. So can you put some light on it, and what kinds of policy mechanisms or global frameworks do you believe are necessary to better include these actors in migration governance processes?
Yes, I think that's a very important point. With Irene Fernández-Molina, our work on migration power emphasizes that power is not just held by states. So we should think about migrants, diasporas, non-state actors that shape how mobility is governed through collective organizing, through political mobilization, through remittances, and everyday networks. I have done some work on the Gulf, and my work on the Gulf shows this vividly. Non-state actors like corporations, recruitment agencies, public-private partnerships, NGOs, all of these instruments and actors do not just carry policy, but they shape and negotiate it. They sometimes even undermine it, actually. In the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, we have found that tadbir centers, construction firms, subcontracting companies, they all play direct roles in migration diplomacy and migration power. So they can reinforce state control, but they can also create and take advantage of loopholes and abuses that weaken protections for migrants. What I would argue is that we need to pay attention to this. We need to include this kind of actors beyond states themselves in our theorization, but we also need to be mindful of the need for protection. I've done work on transnational repression to demonstrate how states like Iran or Russia and others extend surveillance and intimidation to citizens that live beyond their borders. So we need to find ways to safeguard the political rights and safety of migrants, which I think is essential if this participation is to be meaningful.
Yeah. So could you also elaborate on how symbolic or productive forms of migration power, such as the deployment of narratives, framing, or expertise, shape migration-related decisions at forums like the UN or the EU, especially when such influence transcends material interests?
Yes, that is another great question, and that's actually the topic of my next book. This is about symbolic politics, and I'm working on this with a good colleague at Nottingham called Iman Elanis on eco-humanitarian rentierism. What we're trying to show there is how symbolic power or productive migration power matters, because migration governance is not really about material interests alone. It is also about how states stage and frame crisis to generate leverage. And I can give you an example. For instance, our work focuses on Jordan and Egypt, and it looks at how these two states narrate themselves as frontline hosts of displaced populations and highly vulnerable to climate change. So this double crisis framing essentially allows them to lobby for EU aid, seek technical support, political recognition. And I would argue that other states in the global south, Bangladesh, for instance, Tuvalu, Lebanon, they all do something similar. They perform crisis for international audiences because they need to make themselves legible to donors, given that there is an absence of coherent or well-funded global refugee or climate regimes. So what we need to understand is that all of these narratives, they're not just rhetorical, but they also carry, I would say, a form of currency, right? States are able to convert crisis symbolically into capital. And this symbolic dimension works really well alongside structural and institutional migration power, essentially. So again, to repeat what I said at the very beginning, migration power is not, it's never about just physical flows of people across a border. And this is where I think we go a bit further than earlier work on migration diplomacy that tends to emphasize bargaining, right, over mobility flows. By looking at power and migration power, we are able to focus on things like symbolic and productive power, to look at narratives and frames and expertise that shapes what is politically possible, what counts as legitimate, essentially, who gets to set the terms for the discussion, if this makes sense.
Yeah, so given the structural imbalances between the global south and global north, how should policymakers in the north account for the asymmetries you describe, particularly in the context where the global south is compelled to cooperate due to economic or diplomatic pressures? You mentioned the example of Bangladesh. So how do you see all of this?
A couple of points. I would say, firstly, policymakers in the global north, again, they need to recognize what's happening. So crisis diplomacy is not simply blackmail or opportunism. It's a rational strategy, oftentimes of survival, under conditions of structural dependency. Remember, we talked about structural migration power here. So we're talking about debt burdens, we're talking about volatile aid flows, we're talking about security bargains. And I think this is a classic theme in international relations. We need to look at these strategies and these moves as how states in the global south adapt to an unequal global order, right? This is not normative. This is not about moral failings. And once we do this, we need to take a step further and rethink the conditions that the global north attaches to cooperation. A lot of these migration deals, if you go through them, a lot of these climate finance agreements, they include ambiguous legal frameworks. They embed surveillance. They entrench dependency in a way instead of building resilience, right? So I work, as I said, on Egypt quite a lot. If you look at the funding that goes into Egypt nowadays, a lot of this focuses narrowly on border controls. But this doesn't invest in local capacity, right? It just reproduces the same asymmetry between the North and the South. There's a new important book coming out by Nicholas Michinsky and Kelsey Norman that shows exactly this, essentially, how migration management aid can actually even prop up authoritarian regimes, and stifle genuine democratic involvement. And at the same time, I would say what the global north needs to do is to put forth frameworks that genuinely expand policy space for southern governments, predictable long-term financing, fair burden sharing, accountability for donors, not just for recipient states. We need to be listening to the communities that are most affected by this and not just to governments or intermediaries.
Yeah, so you call for a greater flexibility in migration policy making, greater reflexivity in migration policy making. So I would like to conclude by asking that what would a reflexive migration policy look like in practice? And are there any current examples, either positive or problematic, that illustrate where such an approach is working or still needed?
Yeah. Yeah. When I speak of reflexivity, what we mean is that policymakers should see migration governance not as a system that creates strategies and outcomes, but also one that generates effects. We need a reflexive approach to review our assumptions, to learn from outcomes, to adjust effectively. We need to essentially look, for instance, at deterrence measures, right? And see how deterrence might actually not produce the outcomes we want because it may shift flows or disrupt established route, but it can also make smuggling more profitable, right? Or it may push people into more dangerous pathways. So we need to have reflexive thinking. One example of this would be Canada. If you look at Canada's community sponsorship model for refugees, Canada as a state has emphasized how local communities can help shape better outcomes than centralized systems alone. They can build local trust, they can embed a sense of shared responsibility, social ties. There's a great initiative at Carleton University called Local Engagement Refugee Research Network, and we work with them to identify how local actors and refugee-led groups can actually change how protection works, right? And this is only made possible when there is reflexivity and space for these people to contribute ideas and practices. So I would say a reflexive approach needs these kinds of channels, needs this kind of innovative thinking. And migration power does involve choices that shapes relationship across societies. So I would say reflexivity means accepting that policies have ripple effects, and good governance does require the ability to adapt when evidence shows that conditions have changed, essentially.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your valuable insights on the complex interplay between migration and power in today's international landscape. Really appreciate you joining on the Prode. And for our viewers, check out the link in the description box below if you're interested in delving deep into this topic. Thank you once again, sir, for your time.
Thank you very much.